Be sure to check out MythVisionPodcast.com. Help MythVision grow, guys. Become a Patreon member. You guys will get early access to all my videos when I'm done editing them. Also, it's a small community where you guys can message me your questions and talk to me in private. You guys can also donate through PayPal and Cash App. Join the social media links down in the description. We have Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Help the community of MythVision grow. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you guys are notified every time I do a live video and you don't miss any of my content. Ladies and gentlemen, the pioneer on Mimesis criticism, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, will take us into the comparisons and parallels between the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Markan Gospel of Jesus Christ. You guys are going to want to check out this fascinating show. It gets very deep. It's very intellectual. This is like free scholarship here. You're going to really want to dig. And I'm asking you, this is at my heart, that you watch this all the way through and learn from this. Roll this stone over with me and tell me if you guys think there's a literary connection between these stories. If you haven't checked out his book, you really should, so you can see he literally shows diagrams of the comparisons between both texts. He's a pioneer. He's had resistance from what he calls the guild, the scholarship consensus on how one should methodologically approach the Gospels of the New Testament. You guys, I'm personally persuaded by what he's suggesting here. I hope you guys will come at the end and tell me your criticisms or the pros of this position. Do you think he's onto something? Let me know in the comments. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever asked yourself, like I have recently, about the Homeric epics and the Iliad, the Odyssey, having a connection to the New Testament Gospels, especially Mark, Luke, John might even have something going on with Euripides, but we haven't got there yet. Well, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald is joining me today, and instead of reading the huge bibliography, I'll ask that you go check out the previous video so we can get right into the content, no wasting time. He has critics of this view. In fact, the sad part is not many people have actually taken the time to evaluate his mimesis criticism and his methodology on approaching this topic. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and hand it to you, Dennis, because I think, if that's okay, if you mind if I call you Dennis, I think it's important that we get right into the issues at hand that the critical responses to your theory suggest, or what they try to say on, well, that's not the case. They weren't using those sources to develop these gospels. It was just in the air. It was a subconscious, accidental thing where maybe they picked up a motif from when they learned Greek, because they had to read these sources when they learned Greek, or some other way to divorce the genealogical connection between what you're suggesting that takes place in this book, which you must get this book. Absolutely must get this book. Really, really good book. And he's got all the other ones, guys. So, Dr. MacDonald, take us into this. And I'm following you, sir.
Oh, thank you so much, Derek. If it's okay with you, I would like to give a little recap of the first two, not to advertise them, but because I'm going to count on some of that information when I go forward. The first one was basically on the synoptic problem and whether there's a lost gospel cue, from the German word Quelle. And I made an argument that we have literary evidence for a lost gospel in Matthew, Papias, and Luke, that we have social identity issues, that the material that can be recovered from the lost gospel by means of reversed priority, that is, sometimes Matthew's earlier than Mark, or Luke is earlier than Mark or Matthew, has a certain social identity that's different from its host documents in the canonical Gospels. Also, when one assembles these materials into their most likely sequence, we can see that it coheres as a rewriting of Deuteronomy. Now, in order to establish connections, literary and free connections often between two texts, I've established a methodology called mimesis criticism, from mimesis, imitation, in Greek, imitatio in Latin. And it has 7 criteria that we're going to be testing a little later. But it works also for Q and Deuteronomy.
Dr. MacDonald, I hear a noise in the microphone. Are you touching the table or something near it by any chance? Yeah. Okay, I hear a thump, like a
okay,
like almost like something's moving. So I'm sorry. No. Did you want to restart that by any chance?
Yeah,
just because I don't want the audio to be thump. All right, I'm going to give you a 3, 2, 1, and then I'll say, here you go, Dr. MacDonald, and then you can take us back. I don't want, trust me, you'll thank me later. You'll thank me later. I apologize for interrupting you.
I'm all for you.
Yes, sir. Okay. 3, 2. Dr. MacDonald, so if you don't mind, take us off into what we're going to discuss today.
Well, if you don't mind, Derek, I'd like to give a brief recap of the first 2 sessions. The first one was on the synoptic problem and the existence of the Q document, the lost gospel. And the argument was threefold. One is we have evidence for a lost gospel that informed Matthew, Papias, and Luke. And we can recover much of that material by assessing what are called doublets and non-doublets and looking for reversed priority. That is, we know the Gospels were written in this order, Mark, Matthew, Luke. But sometimes a later Gospel has material that's earlier than its known sources, which could come from oral tradition, but it more likely comes from a document, or at least could. So that's a literary argument. We also have a social identity argument. That is, that these materials that we can isolate by reverse priority have a distinctive social identity that's different from the social identities of the authors of the other Gospels. When these materials are collected and arranged, they seem to be a rewriting of the book Deuteronomy to portray Jesus as the prophet like Moses. Now, in comparing 2 literary texts, one needs to minimize the subjectivity of the enterprise, and to do so, I've created 7 criteria, which we'll be talking about again today. One is accessibility. Is the proposed model available? Another is analogy. Are other people imitating the same book? 3rd, 4th, and 5th are density, order, and distinctive traits. There are a lot of parallels. Are they in a similar sequence? And is there something that's unusual that glues them together? Then interpretability is number 6. That is, what is gained for the interpreter by comparing one text over another? Or, if you will, what's gained by the author in rewriting a text? And finally, ancient recognition. Did ancient readers recognize these similarities? So that's what we did in the first session. The second session, we treated Mark mostly and asked, why is Mark such a different gospel from the Q document? The Q document doesn't have a passion narrative. It doesn't anticipate the fall of Jerusalem, although it anticipates it, but it's writing before the fact. The disciples are trustworthy companions, but that's not true in Mark. Mark is writing after the Jewish war, and he considers the Jewish war to be a result of Jewish non-acceptance of Jesus. So he's looking for a literary model that relates the death of a hero with the death of a city. And the most famous one in Greek antiquity was the Iliad, where it's about the siege of a city. It anticipates its fall because of the death of its hero, Hector. And so last time we talked a lot about the similarities between the death and burial of Hector and the death and burial of Jesus. And we applied Mimesis criticism, and it was clear that the Iliad was available. Other people, especially Virgil, imitated the death of Hector, that the parallels, as we saw, were dense, sequential, and distinctive, and other people recognized this. But Mark is not simply replicating Homer. He's transvaluing it because Hector's body stays in a tomb and Jesus's tomb is empty. So that was the argument that we talked about last time. I want to start out this time. Does that sound fair, by the way? Okay. This time I want to say how I stumbled upon Mimesis criticism in the first place, to give an example from the Odyssey, not the Iliad in Mark, and then to say how do people object to this? What are the scholarly arguments lodged against Mimesis criticism? In 1983, I was given a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to work on the Acts of Andrew from the perspective of folklore. I'd already written a book on the Acts of Paul, and the Acts of Andrew at this point was available only in fragments. There was not a critical edition of the fragments. So I actually spent a decade trying to go through the Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, Armenian texts to reconstruct the book. I was at the Folklore Institute to see what, if I could identify the folkloric elements that may have informed this, that is, oral traditions. And it became clear that there were no folkloric oral traditional materials in the Acts of Andrew, that it was literary. And so I felt after my time there that I'd failed. I was ready to drive home from Indiana University at the Folklore Institute to my home in Denver when it occurred to me, walking, just getting exercise at night, that some of the stories I saw in the Acts of Andrew reminded me of the Odyssey. But I hadn't read the Odyssey since high school. I was not exposed to it at Harvard with my PhD in New Testament, and my minor was in Greek philosophy. So the next morning, I delayed my departure and bought a paperback copy of the Odyssey, and unknown to the highway patrols of 5 states, I read it while driving home. And I was astonished, Derek, at what I saw. I saw echoes all over the place to the Acts of Andrew and to other Christian literature. So that issued in a book called Christianizing Homer. It was my first major attempt to integrate Homer with early Christian texts. For quite a while, I thought the Acts of Andrew was unique in this respect, that other texts did not imitate Homer in the same way. But early one morning, when I was preparing a lecture on the Gospel of Mark, I made myself a pot of coffee, got up at 4 o'clock and wanted to give myself a fresh reading of the book. And I was astonished by what I saw. Oh, by the way, let me go back to the Acts of Andrew. The parallels with Homer include shipwrecks, pirates, cannibals, enormous feasts, and most strikingly, Andrew dies on a cross at the edge of the sea that is in the shape of a cross, of a mast. And he says, and he's tied to it, not nailed to it. And he tells the audience, wipe your ears to hear what I say and wrap yourself with my chains around the cross. That's Odysseus at the mast going home with his sailors with wax in their ears so they can't hear the sirens. And the parallels just went on and on. It was astonishing. So let's go back to the Gospel of Mark. I got up early, made myself a cup of coffee, and was astonished. And what I'd like to do is just to read a paragraph from my first book on Mark, that is the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark, because it's trenchant, and I don't think I could say it better even now. Mark's Jesus shares much with Homer, and even more so with shares much with Hector, and even more so with Odysseus. Odysseus and Jesus both sail seas with associates far their inferiors, who weaken when confronted with suffering. Both heroes return home to find it infested with murderous rivals that devour the houses of widows. Both oppose supernatural foes, visit the dead, and prophesy their own returns in the same person. A wise woman anoints each protagonist. Both eat last suppers with their comrades before visiting Hades, from which both return alive. In both works, one finds God stilling storms and walking on water, meals for thousands at the shore, and monsters in caves. Furthermore, Mark's dependence on the Odyssey suggests elegant solutions to some of the most enigmatic and disputed aspects of the gospel. Its depiction of the disciples as inept, greedy, cowardly, and treacherous. Its fascination in the sea, meals, and secrecy. And even its mysterious reference to the unnamed young man who fled naked at Jesus' arrest. But Mark did not steal from the epics. He transvalued them by making Jesus more virtuous and powerful than Odysseus and Hector. Like Hector, Jesus dies at the end of the book. His corpus is rescued from his executioner, and he is mourned by 3 women. But unlike Hector, Jesus was raised from the dead. Mark may have cut his literary teeth on epic, which might also explain a major incongruity in his composition. Despite its rustic, at times barbaric Greek, the Gospel's literary achievement undeniably is brilliant. Some of Mark's brilliance, I submit, is Homeric radiation. So that gives a summary of what I think's going on in Mark and Homer.
That's brilliant. That really is. I mean, I've seen your work used by so many different people, especially one that was excavating the Empty Tomb series on YouTube, where the gentleman starts to date the Gospels, and then he says, oh, it doesn't stop there. He goes into some of the connections that you do right here into the Odyssey, the Iliad, doing the Homeric connections. And he, of course, gives thanks to you, of course, and what you've done. But let me ask you this, since we're going into the critics today, and as well as you teaching us some of the things going into the Odyssey and whatnot, have others seen this, but maybe not seen it as, I don't know, extensive as you have? Or how have they seen it compared to what you've seen it as?
As far as I know, I'm a pioneer in this field, and I don't know of anyone before me that has argued for a literary connection. Of course, people have seen similarities here and there in the narration, but usually attributed them to a common culture. But as far as I know, I'm the only one. Now, there are other people who are doing this kind of work now, as you're aware. But as far as I can tell, I'm the pioneer. I'm also the pioneer of mimesis criticism and its criteria. And I actually think, as a segue to what you're saying, I'd like to read my response to my critics, and then get back to Mark and the Odyssey to see if my criticisms are valid of my critics. Okay? At first, I was not surprised that the responses to my book on the Homeric epics in the Gospel of Mark did not resonate or get legs right away. And the most obvious reason for that would be that most believers in the trustworthiness of the New Testament would not be thrilled with it and would probably just ignore it. But what became very surprising to me is the sometimes vicious resistance I met from my friends and colleagues in the Guild. And these are not fundamentalist Christians. They're enlightened, progressive, scholarly people, and yet they were really and they continue to be very unappreciative of this kind of research. In order to make sense of that, I was reminded of Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in reading that book, it made so much sense to me about the resistance I was getting. So instead of framing it as an ad hominem against me, or even against my methodology, I was able to understand it as the defense of a discipline, so that there are disciplinary factors at play and not ad hominem. They aren't my enemies, but they have different methodologies. And I want to explore that with you. According to Kuhn spoke of a dominating scientific paradigm, which he later clarified as a disciplinary matrix among the sciences. A set of methodologies deployed without question or dissent by group members, shared commitments and beliefs, shared values and behaviors, and what he then called exemplars, or the concrete problem-solving solutions that students encounter from the start of their scientific education. So he's talking about biology and physics and quantum physics and so on. But other scholars recognize that this same phenomenon of a disciplinary matrix works in the humanities, so that there are expectations built into the structures of academic disciplines that are restrictive, not intentionally. So it happens in New Testament scholarship too. Students trained to become New Testament scholars start with textbooks that seldom, if ever, note the influence of classical Greek poetry, let alone Mimesis criticism as a legitimate methodology. Handbooks on exegesis seldom include exemplars of gospel intertextuality apart from Jewish scriptures or other gospels. The most widely used critical text of the Greek New Testament indexes thousands of citations and allusions to the so-called Old Testament, but a measly 4 from Greek literature, 1 each from Herodotus, Euripides, Heraclitus, and Menander. None from Homer. The prestigious Anchor Bible Dictionary could not find space in its 6 wonderful volumes for entries on Homer, Euripides, or even Greek poetry generally. More scandalous is its utter silence about the most formative book shaping Roman politics in the early empire, Virgil's Aeneid. Nothing. According to Kuhn, a scientific revolution commences with the awareness of anomaly. That is, with the recognition that nature has somehow violated the paradigm-induced expectations that govern normal science. Now I'm going to expand on that a little bit with his words. The transition from paradigm in crisis to a new one is a reconstruction of the field from new fundamentals, a reconstruction that changes some of the field's most elementary theoretical generalizations, as well as many of its paradigm methods and applications. So these are what I call inconvenient truths in science. And when you have these inconvenient truths, they issue in things like the new physics and so on. Now, any successful excavation for parallels between the Gospels and Greek poetry, to use Kuhn's terms, become anomalies that threaten the stability of the disciplinary matrix. They are inconvenient truths given to the matrix history. They create a crisis that requires a shift to a new paradigm. Again, Kuhn, when paradigms change, there are usually significant shifts in the criteria determining the legitimacy both of the problems and of the proposed solutions, end quote. That's why my criteria are important, because they're not available in traditional New Testament scholarship. Any questions so far?
Nope. It makes perfect sense. I see this all the time. Academics, great people who probably, like you said, with an adult beverage in front of them, would be perfectly fine. However, there's the guild, and they believe they're defending the discipline, and they think that when you buck against the discipline, it's a natural reaction to suppose you're erroneous. You're not seeing the truth, right. And we're trying to accurately get to the conclusion, and they think they're correctly defending what is right. Exactly. And so you have an uphill battle. You are literally Atlas rolling the ball uphill right now.
Okay, so the next part of my assessment again uses Kuhn, and I entitled it "How the Matrix Fights Back." The disciplinary matrix. Much of the structure of scientific revolutions describes how adherents to matrices of normal science resist new theories to account for inconvenient truths. Although scientists may begin to lose faith and then to consider alternatives, they do not renounce the paradigm that has led them into the crisis. They do not, that is, treat anomalies as counter instances. And they will devise numerous ad hoc modifications of their theory in order to eliminate any apparent conflict. Such resistance characterized the reception of mimesis criticism and includes 4 overlapping strategies that Kuhn has identified. One is denial. Another is accommodation. The third is methodological assaults. And the fourth is marginalization. And I want to tell you what my critics say and just give brief responses to them before we get back to the Odyssey and Mark. Denial. Many scholars say that this project should be aborted from the beginning because the gospel authors and their readers were not sophisticated, well-educated, and not Greek in their orientation. Now that's circular reasoning. How would we know about the sophistication of an author apart from reading what he wrote and understanding how it works? And I will not accept that this is an illegitimate project from the beginning. And by the way, I think the field tends to denigrate the intelligence of its own authors. I don't think Mark and Luke and Matthew were fishermen and nincompoops and peasants. They were, for their time, intellectuals. And they were bicultural intellectuals, in my view. Another criticism is that comparisons do not require literary connection. In other words, parallels between the epics and the Gospels are not worthy of the effort. So, paraphrased, MacDonald, just because you find analogies between 2 stories, one in the Gospels and one in Homer, doesn't mean there's literary connection. That's right. It doesn't. On the surface, it doesn't. But my question then is, how many whiskers make a beard? What I mean by that is, how many parallels in sequence and distinctiveness do you need in order to have mimesis criticism and to have imitation? So or another way to put it that's not so sexist is, how many beans make a pile? Now, yes, you can have parallels between texts that have no literary connection. And you can have parallels between texts that do have literary connection. I'd like to know what criteria you're going to use to make that judgment, and then we can compare them to the stories. Now, unless you have criteria, I'm going to assume that the question of how many whiskers make a beard is still open. Then accommodation. Insofar as the Homeric epics pervaded Greek culture, and by the way, that's undeniable, one can more adequately account for similarities between the Gospels and epic by using traditional historical and cultural criticism. So yes, Homer is everywhere, and Homer is not just in texts. It's in art, it's in architecture, it's on stage, it's in music. As Hegel put it, Homer is the oxygen that Greeks breathed. So MacDonald, when you identify parallels between the Gospels and Homer, how do you know that it's not just Homeric radiation on the culture? And my answer to that is, again, you have to have criteria to determine if the parallels are literary or cultural. And let me back off. I think for Mark's readers, for example, they may not have been able to read Homeric epic. Maybe they did know it simply from the culture. That's what I would assume. That doesn't mean the author doesn't know it or isn't conscious of trying to make this connection. And again, we need criteria for determining it. The next is methodological assaults. That is, okay, how does MacDonald go about identifying these parallels and justifying them? One complaint is that I identified differences between stories as intentional transformations, which my critics say should not be counted as parallels. Now, I'm not saying that the imitations of Greek poetry in the Gospels are xerographic. They are not photocopies. They are transvalued. And the only way to transvalue something is to make changes in it. But those changes can still be significant. A good example is when my daughter was about 4 years old, a friend of ours gave her a book called Sleeping Ugly. It's obviously about Sleeping Beauty. The word ugly is the opposite of beauty. So it is still a parallel, but it's a transvaluative parallel. So I don't buy that differences between them texts can't be significant markers to their connection. Another criticism is that some of the parallels are trite. I agree with that. Some of them are trite. But you need to see them in their context of other parallels. My example for this is looking at the front range of the Rocky Mountains from Denver. Yes, at the very horizon, you see some shadowy peaks that may be peaks or may not be peaks. They may be clouds or they may be illusions. But when you see them at the back of the front range, where you have no doubt about a mountain range, those peaks in the background become more interesting because you have clear examples of, in my view, going back to Mark has clear analogies to the Homeric epics. There is a front range there. Now, some of the parallels I draw are trite, and I'd be willing to sacrifice them in a heartbeat. But I'm not willing to sacrifice And sometimes my critics pick on the bad accounts, and in other cases not.
Back up a sentence or two. I'm sorry, you're not going to, and then you broke out for about a 2-sentence.
I'm not going to abandon the mountain range just because some of the peaks in the distance are faint. But I agree, some of the parallels are trite, and I'd be willing to scrap them. Here's another issue related to this. And it has to do with thinking that I'm the only person who uses this methodology. I'm simultaneously flattered and frustrated that my denigrators associate mimesis criticism exclusively with me, as though I were a Don Quixote, a knight errant tilting at windmills with an occasional and blundering Sancho Panza. I'm not the only person doing this. I may be a pioneer. I suspect that I am. But these criteria need to survive beyond me, and they do. Unfortunately, the disciplinary matrix has been very good at keeping my students out of schools and unemployed. And it's one of the great tragedies of my work that they can't. In fact, I don't know any place in the world right now where students can go and study this. Then marginalization. The argument goes like this. Even if a few mimetic parallels exist, they really don't matter. They're just insignificant. They're window dressing. They're not as important as the other things going on in the text. Now, this contrasts radically with ancient understandings of the literary enterprise. As Quintilian put it, and I quote, and he's writing for his students of rhetoric on how to compose. There can be no doubt that in art, no small portion of our task lies in imitation. Since although invention comes first and is all important, it is expedient to imitate whatever has been invented with success. Above all, poets like Homer and Virgil. Philodemus, another rhetorician, said, "Who would claim that the writing of prose is not reliant on the Homeric poems?" Let me say that again. Who would claim that the writing of prose is not reliant on the Homeric poems? The answer he expected from his culture was no one would deny it. Today, one might answer, most New Testament scholars would deny it. So here is my recap on the opposition to my work. First, denial. Literary parallels between Greek poetry and the gospel simply don't exist and can't exist. So you can ignore it. Accommodation. Even if such parallels do exist, they are not mimetically intertextual, but dynamically intercultural. So traditional historical and cultural criticism is enough, not a literary connection. Methodological assaults. Even if there were intertextual mimetic connections, the proposed criteria of mimesis criticism can't prove it. So therefore, it's a kind of atheistic way of understanding. And then finally, marginalization. Even if one were to prove that some actually were mimetic, the parallels are insignificant mutations. They don't violate the disciplinary matrix generally. They're just blips. Now here's my basic response. No literature was more influential among Greek speakers in the early Roman Empire than the Iliad and the Odyssey. I know of no serious scholar who denies that. Second, literary education and production were dominated by mimesis. And for literary composition, no targets were more popular and culturally contested than the Homeric epics. This too is undeniable. The Synoptic Gospels are heavily populated by analogs to Homeric characters and episodes, and they are so dense, distinctive, and interpretable that they can no longer be ignored. One must account for them somehow. Now, mimesis is one way of accounting for them, but it may not be the only one. But I'm tired of having this business simply ignored. So that's basically my response to my critics. Now, I want to, go ahead. I want you to ask questions, but the next thing I want to do is what Kuhn says about how scientific revolutions take place. What is needed for scientific revolutions to succeed? But go ahead, you were going to ask.
Yeah, let's discuss that in the vein of what you're presenting, because I want it to be on topic here. I think it's fascinating. There has to be an explanation. And when I read Mythologizing Jesus, like one really powerful connection to me that I guess one could, it seems very comforting to act like there's social criticism will explain this. The woman who washes Jesus' feet. Okay, that example is one of the most brilliant connections that I think that you made, because Jesus says, wherever my gospel is preached. And by the way, I want to pause for 1 second before I even mention this statement that I think is so powerful. It's so beautiful too. For those who are believers or who think there's something pretty about the gospels, what you're presenting gives even more weight to the validity of them being intelligent, brilliant people. They're not just they're not idiots. At the same time, you're not saying, oh, well, this proves an inerrancy or infallibility or God has zilch to do with that. You're showing the beauty of authorship here by someone who is definitely creating a masterpiece, a story narrative that ends up surviving and has influenced the Western world till this day. It's just fascinating. So anyway, if it's so dumb, I guess we all were influenced by it in some way. And why were we influenced by it? Why did we see such beauty in this? Why do people think there's something majestic about it? It's because it's such a beautiful story. It's got depth. It touches the human consciousness in so many ways. And so did the Greeks. But that parallel where the woman washes Jesus' feet and he says, wherever my gospel is preached, let this story, let this woman, let this be known what this woman has done pretty much. And of course, you know the literary exact. I'm sure you know this by heart. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus, his scars revealed to the very woman who gave him suckle as a child. And she sees the scar and goes, Master, you know, like what? Like you're captivated in the story because you're like, she doesn't know. She doesn't know. The author's so brilliant that, you know, you're captivated to find out that she knows it's him. And she goes, Master, it makes you want to go, oh, you know, and then all of a sudden he says, shh, don't tell anyone. Her name means far and wide. And what is that name, Dennis, if you don't mind me asking?
Eurycleia.
So
in fact, but go ahead.
It's just, to me, it's like, and this is one, like you said, how many hairs does it take to make a beard? I got a friend who can't grow a beard worth of crap. He's got like 3 or 4 hairs. I'm like, just shave it, man. But anyway, my point is, this is so powerful. How do you not see a literary connection? What kind of criticism to your view can you say? Can't you admit that's a literary connection?
Derek, you picked up on one of the most wonderful stories in Mythologizing Jesus, and I actually want to read it with you now. Okay. Before I go on with my comments. So if you look at Mythologizing Jesus.
Yes, sir.
And I think it's going to be pages 94 to 95, 96.
Okay.
And while you're looking it up, I'm going to help people understand the context.
Okay.
Odysseus can't come home transparently because the suitors will kill him if they know that he's returned. So Athena transforms him into a beggar so that Odysseus can scope out the suitors to collect his allies in order to slay the suitors, which he eventually does. He goes to Penelope, still as a beggar, and wants to reassure her that her husband is going to come home and things are going to be okay. Now, she doesn't really quite believe it yet, but she's grateful for his attempt and has Eurycleia, his old nurse, wash his feet. And when she washes his feet, she recognizes his childhood scar. And Odysseus then says, don't tell anybody, because if the suitors find out, they're going to kill me. By the way, you have the same motif in the Transfiguration. The disciples see Jesus transfigured before them, and he comes down and says, you cannot tell anybody. So this theme of secrecy, which pervades Mark, is a Homeric borrowing. So what we're going to do is to read the two parallels like we did last time.
Okay. I'll read Mark,
I'll be the voice of Homer.
Okay.
You'll be the voice of Mark.
Yes, sir.
Telemachus was amazed at the great light that shone on the walls of his house.
In case anyone's watching, Mark 13, 1 through 4, 28 through 37, and 14, 1 through 11. One of Jesus' disciples was amazed at the great buildings in Jerusalem temple.
Odysseus went to Penelope and sat.
Jesus went to the Mount of Olives and sat.
Penelope in private questioned her husband in disguise.
4 of the disciples in private asked him about the destruction of the temple.
Odysseus answered and gave her signs that he had seen her husband and that he would soon return.
Jesus answered and gave the sign when he would return.
That very day, Odysseus was consulting the oak sacred to Zeus at Dodona.
The disciples should consult the fig tree.
He is near.
He is near.
All these things will come to pass.
Until all these things take place.
No one in Ithaca knew if or when Odysseus would return.
It is like a man on a journey. Keep watch, because you do not know when the Lord of the house is coming.
The suitors were prepared to kill Telemachus and Odysseus.
The chief priests and scribes were seeking some deceitful way to arrest and kill him.
The suitors feared harm from the people of Ithaca.
The authorities feared a popular uprising.
After giving his prophecies to Penelope, Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, sat by himself.
After giving these prophecies to 4 disciples, Jesus sat at table in the humble home of a leper.
Eurycleia came in with a bowl of water and washed his feet. Later, she anointed him generously with oil.
A woman came in with an expensive stone jar of ointment and poured the contents on Jesus' head.
When she recognized her master, she dropped his leg into the brass vessel, spilling water.
She broke the jar to release the oil.
She alone recognized her king.
She alone recognized that Jesus soon would die.
Melantho, the slave girl, had objected to Penelope's generosity to a poor beggar.
People at the mill objected to the woman's extravagant anointing. The ointment could have been sold and the money given to the poor.
Odysseus and Eurycleia discussed the disloyalty of some of the slaves.
Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priest for the purpose of betraying him.
Those parallels are remarkable, and they certainly qualify for enough whiskers to make a beard.
I agree. And in that, the woman's name. There's a literary connection.
That's exactly right.
That like solidifies the level, I think, in which.
Well, in fact, let me read the next paragraph.
Please do.
Which is, I've delayed the most strikingly unusual similarity until now. Jesus praised the woman by saying, wherever the good news is proclaimed throughout the world, what this woman has done will also be mentioned in her memory. That is, this woman will have far-flung renown. She will be Eurycleia, renowned far and wide. The significance of the name Eurycleia was noted by an ancient reader, quote, Eurycleia, she who had far-flung and great fame. So the very name Eurycleia tells us why this woman is going to have acclamation, because of her act of perceptive generosity.
So to put it simply, though, for some, the name of the woman who washed Odysseus's feet was Eurycleia. The statement about the woman in Jesus' narrative was that she would be known far and wide. The very meaning of the name of the woman who washed Odysseus's feet.
Yeah. That is a distinctive trait. In Mimesis criticism, we call that a distinctive trait.
And that should be red flag. I mean, someone might go, that's coincidence or something. And it's like, I don't see it. So you were going to get back to the scientific method. I just wanted to make that comment because I can imagine them being reluctant on jumping on board. But you've pressed on. And did anyone respond? Have you heard anyone like Dr. Ehrman? Is there any other critical scholars that are out there that may have had a statement or have said anything pertaining to your work?
I once had a personal conversation with Bart Ehrman and told him that if I'm right, he would have to rewrite half of his introduction to the New Testament, which has become one of the most popular books used in the disciplinary matrix for introducing people to this literature. And he's, as far as I can tell, even though I consider him my friend, entirely resistant to this methodology. And he doesn't have an alternative. He doesn't even recognize the parallels, as far as I can tell, at least in the last edition of the introduction that I saw. The dominant way of dealing from the perspective of disciplinary matrix with inconvenient truths is to deny them. His silence is the hardest argument. I can't argue with I can't argue with silence. I can argue with a counter argument, but the silence is really deafening.
I would rather see a critic. I'd rather see critique or some type of criticism than the silence. And that's what
Absolutely.
I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do that on the show, so, okay. I didn't mean to deter you off the top.
No, actually, I think there's a beautiful segue from what you just said and what I was going to say. Kuhn has a section on what it takes for scientific revolutions to become revolutions, or that is the recognition of anomalies to a disciplinary matrix to bring real change. And this is what he says, and I think it is so pertinent for me at 74 talking to a young scholar like you. Almost always people who achieve these fundamental inventions of a new paradigm have either been very young or very new to the field whose paradigm they change. And perhaps that point need not have been made explicit, for obviously these are the people who, being little committed by prior practice to the traditional rules of normal science, are particularly likely to see that those rules no longer define a playable game, and to conceive another set that can replace them. When I discovered these parallels to between the Acts of Andrew and Homer, I was 38 years old. I was just out of graduate school. in one of my first teaching positions. This is, if it's going to survive, it's going to have to survive with a new generation. Later, Kuhn says, Max Planck, surveying his own career, sadly remarked that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. Now, I don't want my opponents to die, but it's clear to me that if mimesis criticism is going to thrive, I can't be the only one who's promoting it or is able to see this. And I'm running out of different ways to expose it. I mentioned before, and I want to mention again, that I have a massive new gospel parallel that includes 4 synoptic gospels and 3 Johannine gospels. But what makes it mimetic is that there are long introductions to scores of logia, or stories, that explore these Homeric parallels, and I trot them out with cross-references to previous publications and other scholars. That is what I'm going to consider to be my final legacy. But in order for it to have legs, people have to know it's there. And that's why these YouTube telecasts are so important to me.
Yeah, that's the goal. My goal is to get people aware of ideas. I've had so many different ideas come on the channel, but I really value what you're doing with this, especially when I've had people like Dr. Robert M. Price come on and show that, for example, and we're going to get to these examples, I suspect, and touch on some of Acts, but if, for example, in Acts, there are verbatim connections in certain locations to Euripides. It's like, how can you not admit that there's a genetic connection here? Paul's in his own mouth saying things that come directly from Euripides. So I just say that, and of course, the apologists from Christianity go, well, that means that Euripides borrowed from Acts or something. They always have an explanation to try and get out of it. But my point is Dr. Price has been looking at your work for a while. He agrees with what you're saying. He doesn't care what the consensus says, in the sense that they rule authority on what is the case, which allows him to explore ideas, which puts him on the fringe. But regardless, I respect that. Even if as I tell Dr. Price, I say, I wonder if you're too critical on certain evidence that might work in favor of a certain idea. So he loves me. I love him, just to give you an example. So I listen to what he says. I don't necessarily eat and swallow everything, but I at least chew on it. And that's what I think anyone who considers your theory needs to do, is to chew on mimesis criticism, consider it honestly, especially if you don't have a prior, like you said, a prior disposition that you've literally, the guild has formed in your mind to a point where you're not willing to explore. Dennis, just one comment, and then I'll let you continue, is that I went from fundamentalist Christian to hardcore mythicist on this while doing this channel. I started out this channel, called it MythVision, not mythicist vision, just MythVision, because I believed that mythology was what it was. Didn't realize that that's kind of a prophecy, because it's like, you know what? I'm just saying that in a joke. Like it's coincidental that I named it that and didn't name it mythicist vision. I'm glad I didn't, because a lot of guests wouldn't have come on my show. But in the end, I've gradually come back to center. And right now I'm agnostic, which we're going to get into that debate, of course, with you and Dr. Carrier. But I'm agnostic, and not because, I just want to play it safe. I legitimately can see a developed person, a potentially human man at the basis of this religion. And that's based off research. I'm thankful that I'm not dogmatic. I keep an open mind, but not so open that I'm open to just anything. No, but open enough to say, if you can give me good enough reasons, I really will consider it, because it's not like I have to believe this for faith reasons. I'm not here to impress anybody or to prove something to anybody. It's just for my own satisfaction.
There's another way of by the way, in your original introduction to me, you mentioned that have an undergraduate degree from Bob's University. I was a Christian fundamentalist too. My breakaway happened because of the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam, when I realized that that religion was not the religion that I could handle. And I worked for a while in a church in Northern California as a Baptist youth pastor and music director. By the way, I play a banjo and I'm a music person too. And translated the entire New Testament for myself as a way of dealing with my post-fundamentalist issues, and realized that the moral horizon of these authors who wrote the New Testament was so different from the fundamental values that I had been exposed to that I became really quite radicalized. I never became an atheist at the time or even an agnostic, but rather realized that fundamentalism couldn't be, and my father was a fundamentalist Baptist pastor, but it couldn't work for me. And I made connections with other people and helped start the Sojourner magazine. Jim Wallace and I were roommates for 3 years and are still good friends. And that was a way of getting an alternative understanding of the biblical tradition available to evangelical Christians. And he's still at that point. I'm not at that point any longer. But so your story and mine are similar. I want to say one thing about the mythicist position, anticipating further discussions. It's one thing to say that Jesus is mythologized. It's another to say that Jesus himself is a myth. And in addition to Mimesis criticism, I would like to see people pick up what is called fan fiction. Fan fiction is actually a branch of sociological study that traces how social groups on a fascinating personality and mythologize them. A good example would be Martin Luther King Jr., or another example may be Elvis Presley, or George Washington is a famous American example. So you can have a historical character who becomes radically mythologized to serve the interests of their fans. And they inspire certain kinds of behaviors and music and politics. And so that's the model that in talking to Bob Price and I will talk about probably, is what if we replaced the notion of a mythical Jesus to a fan-based Jesus, and to see how mimesis is a part of the creation of appreciation for that historical figure that includes mythology, includes Homeric and Euripidean parallels. So perhaps we can have that conversation at some point.
Yeah, we definitely are going to make that possible for sure. For sure. And I want the comments down below. Anyone watching, tell us what you think so far about the show. I really am enjoying this. And Dennis, it's always a pleasure to interview you and to learn from you. There's so much that you're teaching. I guess we can get to a few. Have you seen, let me ask you this question, because this is good. Have you seen anyone who's in the academic realm that wasn't necessarily a direct student of yours that found you and said, hey, you're right. I think you're right. And I really appreciate your work.
I have emails coming to me at least once or twice a week from people who are like that. So yes, there is, outside of the guild, there is some appreciation. And I think that's going to be the case for a while. Let me say one more thing about the disciplinary matrix we call classics. I consider myself to riding two horses, one as a classicist and the other as a New Testament scholar. And I am disappointed that those two matrices don't have more in common and don't have more discussion between them. So there are some classicists who like my work and who give it some legs, but they don't do it themselves. They kind of watch from a distance. But for the most part, classicists have their own disciplinary matrix, and they're not interested very much, usually, there are exceptions, in Jewish or Christian adaptations. So it takes a certain kind of classicist who's interested in the reception of literature in multiple cultures, and not the kind of rock-ribbed philologians that characterize many classicists. And by the way, I have tremendous respect for classicists. I probably read as much in that field as I do in my own. So this is not denigrating what they do. I just wish that we weren't in different silos, or that the membrane between classics and biblical studies was more porous, and we had more symbiosis and discussions between these groups. But yes, I do get affirmation from people that say, I just happened to discover this book, and it's really quite gratifying. I get quite a bit of it, but not from my colleagues in the field.
Right. I expect that. I mean, it sometimes can even be competitive too. I hope it's more disciplinary, but I suspect there's competition as well. And I don't know. We humans, we do have egos. Humans have egos.
Oh, really? We do?
Right. Yeah. I just wanted to remind everybody in case they didn't know. That's why I feel very comfortable being agnostic on many things. I'm by definition atheist. Of course, that goes into what I believe about things. But what I mean by agnostic is in these questions for searching for the historical Jesus, and in all of these ideas, I've remained that way. But when I read your book on mythologizing Jesus, if you were to have me like stand and try and debate this point, I don't think I could. I haven't read enough and like studied it enough to debate it. But I am convinced that there is a real connection here, and it's not just a cultural. Well, remember 12 years ago when you learned how to read Greek? That story just had an impression on you, and you live in the culture, so people talk about the stuff from time to time. So you just ended up picking up on it. I do think that they did it on purpose, a literary connection on purpose, and that makes more sense to me in light of what I've researched and looking at these connections, especially when you add in the mimesis criticism, the idea of in sequential order. And that's when you start to see some connections. You're like, can you just remember that?
That's
Is it just
exactly
memory
right.
that you think, and another thing, Dennis, is even if it was, let's say in the culture, I suspect some of the stuff was memorized, right? So you can pretend they don't even have let's say this is Homer, the Iliad, all right? And that's over here on the desk. And you've read this so much that you know it by heart. There's probably plays out there in the theater nearby where you're hearing it. That's the same as saying you're using
exactly
that text.
Right.
Okay.
Regardless, I mentioned Quintilian earlier, and Quintilian is extremely helpful on this point. He said that the student should read Homer many times in order to saturate themselves with this material. And if you want to imitate something, give yourself a strategic reading of that text many times so that you can internalize it. So that mimesis needn't be from manuscript to manuscript, from papyrus to papyrus. It goes through the imagination very much, and this is another thing that happens in the rhetorical discussions. It's like a cow chewing cud. You take in the grass, and it gets processed to some extent in one of the stomachs. It comes back and it gets then chewed again and digested. Another image is of a bee that collects pollen from various flowers, in our case, Jewish and Greek flowers, to create honey. so that there's a transformation in mimesis. And the reason Quintilian is important is, my guess is that, let's say Mark is rewriting the story of the anointing of Jesus, or rewriting the story that he sees about Eurycleia. It doesn't mean that he has a text in front of him. It could mean that he remembered the story, wanted to use it as a model, and read it several times to try to internalize what are the things that would make this most compelling. And then he composed. Now, one of the unknown issues, and it may be unsolvable, is what technologies of mimesis do we have? Do we have simple memory? Do we have what I call strategic readings, like in Quintilian? Do we have textually oriented, quid pro quo, take a line here and you adapt it in your own work? We don't know that, and we may not be able to. But to think that the only method of imitation was from manuscript to manuscript is not what I'm articulating, and you were really perceptive to pick that up.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, because I could see that being a criticism. I could see someone trying to straw man, and I'm not trying to say that they're doing that. I could see the potential straw man developed there, and that fundamentalist tendency when you see your opponent's work is to go, okay, well, he's trying to say this is literally being borrowed, and they're literally looking at the manuscript and say, I'm going to change that, I'm going to change that, and not the imaginative.
That's not
right. It. Yes, sir. So that actually brings flexibility to mimesis criticism, where it is a organic idea, not just some strict monolithic, you have to think in it this way. No, there's some imagination to this.
Let me bounce off of that. Anticipation of our next session. Redaction criticism is in danger of reducing the evangelists to scribes. But they are not scribes. They are authors. Now, sometimes they do things that are scribally conservative. And Matthew calls himself a scribe, basically, and he very carefully reproduces Mark and probably the Lost Gospel. But you could hardly call Luke or the Johannine evangelist scribes. They are truly artists. And without denying that you have scribalism in the synoptics and in John, these authors are authors. They're not just scribes. They're not interested in faithful Xeroxing with a few tweaks. They are interested in creating a new narrative, often driven by a new social identity. So one of the great advantages of mimesis criticism, and I discussed this at length in the book that's coming out, is to reward and celebrate the gospel authors are creative theological authors and creative and brilliant. And to reduce them to scribes is really to denigrate and, to be blind to their brilliance.
I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think Matthew seems to be most scribal, of course. And of course, he's very Jewish. But apart from Matthew, you start to see even Mark does something totally different. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah. And this is wonderful. This is why everybody has to read this. It's really not a long read. It's really, it's not, it's pretty good. It's dense in terms of what it is. The material is really good, but it's an easy read. 152 pages. Then you're at the appendix. It's worth reading for anyone who has not read this book. I'm not just saying this. I want you guys to really check out this one of all of them. Even if you're not into the Q stuff yet, right? Which I wasn't into the Q stuff till not long ago when I started taking an interest on trying to understand, Why would it matter if there was one or not? And what does it do if there is? But getting into this was so poetic. And you have the charts, you've got boxes. I want to show them, like, just to give them an example. So I don't know if you guys, is this too bright? It's probably too bright. Let me see if you can dim it. Okay. Yeah. So these charts, these boxes, he separates them, separating between the Odyssey and in a few spots, the Iliad, or one spot, I think it is in this book that you particularly talk about a different source being used, and it's about Hercules, but mostly the Odyssey, which, check it out. And I mean, I said this at the beginning, the last episode that we did about this book, some of the points aren't as strong, like they're not as obvious, but if the imagination's there in terms of they're an artist working off of the theme that, okay, we have Hebrew scriptures and we also have this powerful, potent story that it runs in the vein of all of the Greco-Roman world. I personally find the New Testament to be this syncretistic, Hellenized version of a Judeo-Greco-Roman world. It's almost like if we were back in the 1920s and there's black and white bathrooms, it's almost like having a mixed bathroom. Okay. It's like they're trying to blend the worlds. And I love it. There is some value in that they're trying to blend the worlds. Philo is trying to do some of this stuff, but the New Testament really took it to the next level. So, Dr. MacDonald, do you have anything you'd like to say before we go? Because I didn't mean to cut you off.
If it's okay, I'm going to pick up Mark's imitation of the Odyssey one more time next time. But most of the time we're going to be spending on Luke Acts. And I'll make an argument that by no means was Mark unique among the gospel authors in doing imitation. And Luke must have recognized what Mark had done because he so brilliantly extends it. So please join us again next time, and we'll run a bridge from Mark into Luke Acts, and we'll talk not about Homeric imitation only, but also imitations of Euripides Bacchae. Thank you, Derek.
No problem. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you go down in the description, get the books, help support what Dr. MacDonald's doing, spread this word, get this spread out there, share this in groups. I mean, you're getting like really an academic course in this right here. Like, you're getting academic, this is real scholarship, legitimate information right here on MythVision podcast. You know, you're not going to find this everywhere. It's just not out there like this, especially him being the pioneer of this concept, this idea, mimetically connecting these ideas to Euripides, Bacchae, you know, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Homeric epics, if you will, and the Greek world, connecting it to a Jewish one. You aren't going to find this anywhere else. And I ask that you share this, like this, go and get the books down below to help him get more people who are new to these ideas that may not know too much to check this out, because I'm in love with this idea. I'm pretty sure it shows, and I want you to as well. So thank you so much, Dr. MacDonald. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Enjoy, everybody.
Enjoy, and don't forget, we are MythVision.